Yes, we are celebrating. Good morning, class, or good afternoon, or whenever it is exactly you're watching this video. This is our very first YouTube lecture for the year, and I want to welcome you to APUSH. Now, there's some things I'll point out to you as we go through this lesson. We're going to be looking at overall key concepts throughout the course of the year, and I'll explain that as we go through this, and I'll explain it in class as well. This is period 1. Now, this doesn't mean class period 1, but we're going to be looking at 9 periods of history, and this is the first one, 1491 through 1607. 3 worlds collide. You'll also find out that there is a video log worksheet that goes along with this video. You'll find that on Edmodo, and again on Monday I'll give you all the information for that as well. So let's go ahead and get into the slide and see what it is we're going to be doing this year. We're always going to start off with an overall big picture question. So here you see on a North American continent controlled by American Indians, contact among the peoples of Europe, the Americas, and West Africa created a new world. Why and how? And that's what we're going to be talking about now. Period 1 is not one of those things that's tested heavily on our exam, so we're only going to look at a little bit of this. We're only really spend a couple of days tops talking about this period, and then we're going to move into period 2 by Wednesday. Now, here's something that's new this year. Each of these periods are also going to have 3 key concepts. Now, I'm not going to sit here and read these verbatim. At this point in time, you can pause the video and write them down if you want, or you can take a snapshot of them if you can from your computer. Also, I'll have these obviously posted in the classroom as well, and we'll refer back to them as we talk about these things in class. But I do want you to take note of just a couple things here. In key concept 1, we're just basically talking about how Native people had this wide variety of social, political, and economic structures. Very complex societies were Native American people. In concept 2, we're going to talk about the Columbian Exchange, how both Europe and the Americas both benefited and suffered from this exchange of not only just food, but also cultural ideas and various things. And in the third one here, we're going to talk about how both the American Indians, Africans, Europeans, as their contact within 20 years, 50 years, 100 years of being together like this, it begins to challenge how they begin to view each other and view the world. Well, let's go into some of the stuff that will tie into key concept 1. You notice it says 1.1. What that means is this is period 1, so 1491 to 1607, and key concept 1. It tells us here that before the Europeans arrived, people in Americas, they had a very complex structured societies throughout North America, Central America, South America, and also what we call the Caribbean Sea. In all this area, Indians were not what Europeans thought of as uncivilized. In fact, they were highly civilized individuals. They had very well-complex political, social, economic structures. Most of them were patriarchal, led by men, but several of them were also matriarchal, led by women. They interacted with their environment, as we'll talk about here in a little bit. As Native people we're talking about, began to migrate and settle across North America, they started to create their own unique little societies based on the environment that they lived in and how they can also manipulate the environment. One key factor to all of this, and something you're probably very familiar with, is the word maize. That is the word for corn. That became something very, very important to these various societies. And as they cultivated corn in different areas, it helped them to not only transform their environments, but also what type of political and social systems they would develop. Sometimes there were certain groups, though, that lacked any real resources. For instance, we'll talk later on about the Great Basin and the Great Plains Indians, who are mostly nomadic individuals, because there really wasn't the type of land that they lived in where they could settle down and create villages and eventually create huge, massive, permanent societies. We're also going to talk a lot about the Northeast and the Atlantic Seaboard, especially when the English come over into what is today Virginia, all the way up through New England. We'll see very complex societies there, and some of them are mixed. Some of them are highly agricultural, others are hunter-gatherers. Now, example. Now, I want you to take note of something. When you see example, what this means is all that you see here on this page, none of this is going to show up in a multiple choice question. Okay, so you don't have to worry about that. However, let's say I give an essay. Do you think Mr. Linhart might give an essay? Yes, I do. Any one of these that you see here could serve as an example to a question in an essay. You wouldn't have to write about all of this, but maybe there was something here you remembered. If someone was to ask you, how could you show that the Native Americans really did create complex societies, socially, politically, economically? Well, any one of these could work. This is particularly taken from a book from a man named Alan Taylor. He wrote a book called The American Colonies. I like to use this book often. And here are just two Indian groups that I chose at random, Hohokam and Anasazi. And he tells us, and it's very true, don't ever worry much about the Indian names. They are scholarly inventions anyways. In other words, historians often make up these names, or as Europeans came over, the French, the Dutch, the English, and they could not pronounce the local languages, they would just make up names to give them. But we see that these groups, these two particular groups, have a very long history here in the Americas. Very complex cultures, very populous. They're also very politically independent. That word Pueblo, you might recognize that word. That's a Spanish word. That's actually the Anasazi are the ancestors of the Pueblos. So that's a direct connection there. Now, interesting, some of the things that they didn't have. Well, they didn't have beast of burden. I put that all in caps because this is going to go into, we talk about the Columbian Exchange. Not only did food go back and forth, but Europeans introduced domesticated animals, something that was very new to Indian cultures. They never domesticated the animals. Most of them didn't have a writing system or even use the wheel, but they did have highly complex economic systems because they traded with each other, especially with the peoples of Mexico. Now notice this, irrigation works. If someone was ever to say, well, the Indians never cultivated the land, they didn't know how to take care of it, well, that's obviously wrong. They created massive irrigation works, many of these societies did. They learned how to bring water from one region into another. Again, corn, right? The maize cultivation led them to learn and how to irrigate farmland for them. It also helped them create massive labor systems. And I put this picture here on purpose. Whenever you talk about a culture and society, one way you can always tell that they're very complex is the art. Here's their ceramic tradition. These are ceramic pots that serve a purpose, obviously. Carry water, put food in it, maybe store other, maybe dry beans in it. You never know what it's used for, but it's not just a clay pot. Look at the art that they put on here. Look at how they express themselves through art. This always shows us that peoples around the world are highly civilized. They have an understanding of who they are, understanding of the world and the environment around them, and they'll express it often through their art, their music. Okay? So that's examples that you could pull from if you were to get an essay on this. Let's go back to the key concept, though. So as the Europeans are now starting to come, the Portuguese and the Spanish are one of the first to come over. Things begin to change. This Columbian Exchange is coming, both positive and negative. A negative is deadly diseases that come, deadly epidemics come over. But it also led to one positive thing within the Spanish culture, and that becomes the racially mixed populations that create here. An example, mestizo. When you see example again, that tells you I will never put that on a multiple choice test, but you could use it as an example in an essay. But you would want to know that this did happen. Okay? As Spain begins to conquer much of Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, the Portuguese an intermixing of native people and Spanish, and eventually even Africans. And over time, Spain develops a system that begins to embrace this as part of their culture in the Americas. In fact, a lot of us today, or a lot of people today who have their roots in Latin America, are often very, very proud of their Indian heritage. Mexicans are very proud of Aztecs. People of Peru are very proud of their Inca heritage. You're not going to get this with the English. And that's something that is a difference. It's very important that you take note of that. It's very different for the English. They will not want to have part of their society mixed blood. They become very racist in this idea. Of course, the Columbian Exchange, again, since elementary school, you've probably heard of this, the various foods that come from America and go to Europe, what came from Europe and came to America. Not all good. When the Europeans come here, they also brought weeds, right? They brought their own grass with them, and that introduced new weeds into the America. They brought rats with them, so you get vermin comes into America, which brought disease. Here's an example now. Again, going back to American colonies, we talk about these diseases. Well, why are they so one-sided? Why is it that the Europeans brought over these terrible diseases, wipe out 2/3 or more of the native populations, but the natives did not in turn pass terrible diseases onto the Europeans? Well, one reason, again, we've learned this perhaps through world history or maybe even in elementary school, native people came over from Asia through Siberia over what is known as the Bering Straits when perhaps during the last ice age, coming through the subarctic climate, much of these pathogens could not survive. So the native people here were very fortunate in that. So as they began to now cultivate North America, Central America, South America, they're not going to deal with a lot of these diseases. So the Europeans introduced things that they did not build up natural immunities toward. But why did the Europeans develop such terrible diseases? Well, Alan Taylor talks about three basic reasons. Long-distance trade. Europeans were trading with Asia, they were trading with Africa, with India, and so that brought them in contact with a lot of people and began to pass diseases back and forth. Urbanization. Europeans began to pack themselves into these cities mostly made of wood, with very poor water systems, no waste management to speak of, which just led to bacteria and diseases. Also very interesting, Europe, Africa, and Asia, they all domesticated animals, and they lived amongst large numbers of domesticated animals. So you might say, well, why is that important? Well, there are a lot of diseases that animals can have that eventually can mutate, and humans can be affected from it. Smallpox, one of the most deadliest of the diseases of the time period, right? Today, you hear of swine flu. There's a reason why it's called swine flu. It originates within pigs and has mutated, it now affects humans. When you live constantly, generation after generation, with domesticated animals, you can start to spread disease. Remember, we saw on the slide earlier as an example, Indians didn't have beast of burdens, so they never experienced that. So again, some good examples for you if you write an essay here. Let's get back to our key concepts here. Of course, now slavery is something we're going to talk a lot about in class. I'm not going to really hit hard on it right here, but just to give you some ideas, the Spanish and the Portuguese, they began to trade with West Africa, which led them to exploit this type of local resources that people in West Africa were already doing. People in West Africa were already enslaving other African societies, and it became a natural extension of trade for the Portuguese and later on the Spanish, so they can bring this labor into the Americas for them. It also began to affect the economic, social, and political development then of what is the Americas, and we'll talk a lot of that about in class. Also bringing in new crops, the new livestock also had an impact on the developments in the Americas. Locally, the Spanish, they tried at first to use Indian labor. Now here's a word you're going to need to know because this could show up in a multiple choice question, an encomienda. An encomienda, and I apologize for my terrible Spanish accent because I don't have one. This is a word that literally means a land grant. the kings of Spain would give land grants to these conquistadors, and they would literally own the land and any persons living on the land, the native people. And thereby they were supposed to take care of them, but it didn't always work out that way. But over time, they eventually left the encomienda systems and they began to replace this with African slavery. This also brought about a lot of changes socially, religiously for people. It led to a lot of competition within Europeans because as the rest of Europe saw the wealth of Portugal and Spain begin to rise, well, a lot of jealousy moves in. The Dutch, for instance, especially, they will create one of the largest trading empires in the entire world and go into massive competition with the Spanish and the Portuguese. Then eventually the French, and of course the English, but also groups like the Swedes. We often don't talk about them, but they were also part of this as well. And so various reasons led European expansion as well. Some do not simply want new sources of wealth, but like in the Spanish situation, they wanted to convert natives to Christianity. New crops that are being grown in the Americas, for instance, tobacco, led to a huge explosion of wealth for the English, and it helped to change the economic system in Europe. Europe was part of what was called feudalism, and eventually they will develop into capitalism. Mercantilism is something we'll talk a lot about. That's the in-between, between feudalism and capitalism. They developed mercantilism first. Obviously, we're going to talk a lot about that in class, and eventually capitalism will come to rule the world. Also, this helped to improve technology. You want to get to the New World quicker. The ships of the medieval period could never really have made those journeys. So new technologies, technology stolen from Asia, technology stolen from the Muslims, and reintroduced into Europe. These are things that will help drive colonization and exploration as well. Going into key concept 3, we also begin to see that throughout this contact now between Africans and American Indians, it altered the way Europeans begin to view the world. This form of racism begins to develop. They begin to differentiate between the white world and the non-white world. They didn't understand the cultures of Africa. They did not understand, nor many of them even want to understand, the cultures of the Native Americans. A word we'll talk about a lot throughout class, but it's an example, so I'll never actually test you on this, but it would be good to use in an essay, is Herrenvolk philosophy. This idea of white supremacy develops over the next 100, 200 years. And they begin to classify what's a civilized person versus an uncivilized person. It was a way of justifying white superiority, and it does lead to terrible racism here in America. Now, both Africans and Native Americans, it's not like they just gave up. You know, oh, you're going to enslave me. Oh, you're going to take away my land. No, there's going to be challenge to this. And we're going to talk in class a lot about this. Their core belief systems. They're going to try to hold on to their religion. They're going to try to hold on to their gender roles. But Europeans are going to try to change that on them. They're going to try to force their will upon them. And that's going to lead to a lot of conflict, both within the Native Americans and within the African culture. All right. Come to the end of this now, and here's just some, when you get the textbook on Monday, here's some readings that will further help you understand what we just talked about. And I give you the page number and the specific subtopics you want to look at. And just as a way of don't panic over this, and I'll explain this a lot in class, and I'll show you verbatim what it is. You'll see that even though it looks like it's a lot of pages, a lot of times it's just a paragraph here and half of a paragraph there. So it's really not that much reading. But it's good for you to kind of keep up with this so that you can kind of make sure on your own, you're also doing your own investigation, you're doing your own research, so you can then build upon what we're studying here in history. Well, I appreciate your time and hope to see everybody very soon here in class. For me, it'll be tomorrow because I'm doing this on Sunday. All right. Bye-bye.